Laura was the kind of person who brought life to any room. She wasn't just well-liked by her co-workers at St. Mary's Hospital. She was loved. The kind of love that made people want to stay near her, to bask in her warmth. She was the nurse who remembered everyone's birthdays, stayed late to help with tough cases, and always wore a smile that could make the worst days feel bearable. But after the night shift in Ward C, no one spoke her name. Not out of disrespect, but out of fear. Laura disappeared that night. The shift started like any other. The regular bustle of the hospital had quieted, and Ward C, isolated in the oldest wing of the building, felt like another world altogether. Once a pediatric ward, its faded pastel murals and chipped tiles now gave the place an uncanny, forgotten feel. Renovations were underway, but part of the ward was still operational for overflow patients. Laura didn't mind working Ward C. She wasn't superstitious like the others. Stories of odd noises, doors opening on their own, or flickering lights were just that, stories. The ward's eerie reputation didn't scare her. Just an old building creaking, she'd laugh. A hospital's bound to feel a little haunted, isn't it? She clocked in at 8 p.m., starting with her usual rounds. 5 patients, all post-op recoveries, lay sedated in their rooms. They were stable, quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. Awesome. By 11 p.m., the unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, small things Laura dismissed. A distant tap-tap-tap sound echoed faintly down the hall as she checked charts at the nurse's station. She paused, listening. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but slow, deliberate. Probably maintenance, she muttered to herself and returned to her paperwork. Minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. It startled her. She glanced at the system, but no voice followed, just the faint hum of static. Laura leaned over, pressing the button. "Hello?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. No response. The intercom cut off abruptly. Laura shrugged, dismissing it as a glitch. The building was ancient, after all. Her first real chill came around midnight. She was in room 308, adjusting the IV line for Mr. Harris, a patient recovering from knee surgery. The room felt unnaturally cold, and she tugged her sweater tighter around herself. As she turned to leave, she froze. A hand brushed her shoulder. She turned swiftly, expecting to see a coworker, but the room was empty. The door was closed. Her pulse quickened, but she shook her head, laughing nervously. "You're tired, that's all," she whispered to herself. "Keep moving." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By 12:45 a.m., Laura decided to step away for a break. The hallway leading to the staff lounge felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering faintly. She heard something. Her name. "Laura!" The voice was soft, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She stopped in her tracks, glancing around. The hallway was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. Silence. Her steps quickened, and when she reached the lounge, she practically burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her. Her hands shook as she reached for a cup of water, trying to steady her breathing. "Get a grip, Laura," she whispered, pacing the small room. She glanced down at her wrist as she drank. That's when she noticed them. Faint red marks wrapped around her arm, as though someone, or something, had gripped her tightly. She ran her fingers over the marks, wincing at the tenderness. She didn't have time to process what she saw before her phone vibrated on the counter. Grateful for a distraction, she grabbed it, expecting a text from a coworker. But the message was nothing she expected. "We need you, Laura." Her throat went dry. The number was untraceable. She tried calling back, but the line didn't connect. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. It sounded like a gurney tipping over. Her instincts kicked in, and she bolted from the lounge to investigate. The hallway was empty. Everything was as it should be. No fallen gurney, no sign of an accident. And yet Laura felt it again. The unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. She turned slowly, her breath hitching. At the end of the hall, something moved. A shadow, barely perceptible, slid into one of the rooms. She couldn't make out a figure, but the air felt thick with an oppressive energy. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. No response. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Laura walked toward the room. Her steps echoed unnaturally, as though the hallway were amplifying the sound. She reached room 314 and hesitated at the door. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the vitals monitor. She stepped closer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The bed was empty. "Impossible," she whispered. The patient assigned to this room had been sedated, immobile. There was no way he could have left. Her phone buzzed again. She fumbled for it, the screen illuminating her pale face. "Behind you." Laura's heart stopped. Slowly, she turned. The figure stood inches from her now, its translucent form faintly illuminated by the hallway lights behind it. Its face was obscured, but it reached for her with long, thin fingers. She screamed, stumbling back, but the room seemed to shrink around her. The walls closed in, the air thickening, suffocating. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was his hand, cold, heavy, pressing against her chest. When the day shift arrived, Laura was gone. The only trace of her was her phone, lying cracked on the floor of room 314. The last message on the screen read, "Come back, Laura. We need you." But Laura never came back. Would you like to develop specific elements further, such as Laura's background, the figure's origin, or the hospital's history? The clock struck midnight in the sprawling, eerily quiet office. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting faint shadows on the walls. Sarah leaned back in her chair, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Working the night shift wasn't new to her, but tonight felt different. The air seemed denser, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Across the room, Mark sat at his desk, typing away with the focused determination of someone who wanted the night to end as quickly as possible. Sarah glanced at him, hoping his presence would ground her nerves. "Mark," she said softly, her voice slicing through the oppressive silence. "Do you feel strange tonight?" Mark didn't look up. "Strange how?" he replied, his tone distracted. "I don't know," Sarah muttered, rubbing her hands together. "The air feels heavy, and it's colder than usual." Mark shrugged, brushing off her concerns. "It's probably just the AC cranked too high. We'll finish soon and be out of here. Don't overthink it." Sarah nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She returned to her screen, but her focus wavered. Her eyes kept darting to the glass doors leading to the hallway. In the reflection, distorted by the office lighting, she thought she saw movement, a fleeting shadow that didn't belong. "Mark," she called out again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you sure the main doors are locked?" Mark finally turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "Yes, I checked them myself when we got here. Why?" "I thought I saw something. Someone," Sarah said, trailing off. Mark sighed, his irritation clear. "There's no one here but us. Relax, Sarah." She forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her. Shaking her head, she tried to dismiss her growing paranoia. The first signs. Minutes ticked by in silence, broken only by the soft clacking of keyboards and the occasional shuffle of papers. Then it started. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of the computers, but Sarah heard it. Her heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" She whispered. "Hear what?" Mark asked, not bothering to look up. "That tapping," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark stopped typing, finally paying attention. They both listened, the silence stretching painfully long. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, like fingers drumming against glass. Sarah turned to the glass doors, but there was nothing there, just their reflections staring back at them. "You're imagining things," Mark said, his tone dismissive. He returned to his work, but Sarah couldn't shake the sound. Moments later, a cold draft brushed against the back of her neck. It was subtle, like someone lightly exhaling. She yelped, jumping out of her chair. "Now what?" Mark asked, annoyed. "Something touched me," Sarah exclaimed, rubbing the back of her neck. Mark stood up, stretching. "You're overtired. Let's grab some coffee. You need to calm down. The tension builds." The hallway leading to the break room was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering in intervals. Sarah walked close to Mark, her nerves on edge. She glanced behind them, convinced she felt eyes watching her, but there was nothing there. In the break room, Mark poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Sarah, his fingers brushing hers. She flinched, almost dropping the cup. His touch felt wrong, cold, clammy, as if his hand didn't belong to him. "You okay?" he asked, frowning. "Yeah," Sarah lied, stepping back. She tried to ignore the sensation, chalking it up to her frazzled nerves. Back at their desks, the silence returned, but it was heavier now, charged with an unsettling energy. Sarah's gaze kept drifting to the far end of the office where the shadows seemed darker, deeper. She swore she saw movement, a figure darting between the desks. "Mark," she whispered urgently, "I saw something." Mark sighed loudly. "For the last time, Sarah, there's no one here." "I'm serious," she said, her voice rising. Mark stood abruptly. "Fine, I'll check it out, just to prove there's nothing." "Stay here." Before she could protest, he walked away, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Mark's disappearance. Sarah waited, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her desk. The seconds stretched into minutes, and still, there was no sign of Mark. "Mark!" she called out, her voice shaky. Silence. She stood, her heart pounding, and slowly made her way toward where he had gone. Each step felt like a lifetime, the office now a maze of looming shadows and eerie stillness. When she reached the end of the room, Mark was gone. "Mark, this isn't funny!" she shouted, her voice echoing unnaturally. Then she felt it, a touch on her shoulder, firm and unmistakable. She spun around, expecting to see Mark, but there was no one there. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she backed away. Her eyes darted to the glass doors, and that's when she saw them. Dozens of handprints, smudged and overlapping, as though pressed from the inside. The encounter. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as she stumbled backward. The handprints began to shift, sliding across the glass, forming new patterns. Her reflection in the glass twisted, its face smiling back at her with a grin that was impossibly wide. Then Mark appeared, stepping out of the shadows. But it wasn't Mark. His eyes were empty, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Sarah," he said, his voice distorted and layered with others. "You shouldn't have stayed." She backed away, trembling. "What's happening?" "They like the way you feel," he said, stepping closer. His hands stretched toward her, the fingers unnaturally long and thin. Sarah turned and ran, her breath hitching as she sprinted toward the main doors. She yanked at them, but they wouldn't budge. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices. Mark's voice echoed, low and menacing. "You can't leave. Stay with us." The final moments. The lights flickered violently, plunging the office into darkness. Invisible hands clawed at Sarah, pulling her back toward the center of the room. She screamed, her voice lost in the overwhelming noise. The screen cuts to black. Aftermath. The office is shown the next morning, bathed in sterile daylight. Everything appears normal, untouched. The camera pans over 2 desks, where 2 neatly folded sets of clothes sit. The glass doors are covered in countless handprints, faint whispers echoing as the screen fades to black. The clock struck 10 p.m. as Mallory adjusted her name tag on the freshly ironed uniform of her late shift job. She hated the thing. It dug into her collarbone, leaving faint red marks. Still, there was something comforting about slipping into her routine. The fluorescent lights of the small diner buzzed faintly, their flickering matching the restless hum of her thoughts. The diner sat on the edge of a long, desolate highway, a place for travelers to stop and refuel. Mallory liked working the night shift because it was quiet, predictable, and devoid of the daytime chaos she'd grown to resent. She could work in peace and let the hum of the diner drown out her life's complications. The customers, like the diner, were unremarkable. Most nights, truck drivers shuffled in, their faces weathered by the road. A few locals showed up too, drawn more by the loneliness of the night than the quality of the food. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something heavy, like the diner itself was holding its breath. Mallory glanced out the wide front windows. The road stretched endlessly, fading into the dark horizon. Her stomach churned slightly, though she didn't know why. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. The first couple of hours were uneventful. A truck driver ordered black coffee and a plate of hash browns. A woman with a sleeping baby in her arms requested a quiet corner booth and a pot of chamomile tea. They came and they ate, they left. It wasn't until 12:03 a.m. that the bell above the door jingled softly. The man who entered was tall and gaunt, his frame draped in a long, outdated coat. His posture was stiff, his movements slow, as if every joint in his body protested each step. His skin was unnaturally pale, with a faint bluish tint around his lips, as though he hadn't seen the sunlight in years. Mallory's eyes were drawn to his hands. They were oddly long, with thin, skeletal fingers. The nails yellowed and uneven. "Just one?" she asked, her voice steady, though her unease prickled at the back of her neck. He nodded once, his movements sharp and mechanical. Something was wrong with his eyes, she thought. They didn't seem to focus, yet they bore into her with a strange intensity that made her stomach churn again. He shuffled toward a booth in the far corner, the one where the light bulb flickered more than usual. Mallory handed him a menu, but he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he said, in a voice that sounded cracked and dry, "I'll take whatever's special." "Sure thing," Mallory replied, retreating to the counter as quickly as she could. Her heart was pounding now, though she didn't fully understand why. The cook, Pete, was flipping burgers lazily on the grill. "Got a weird one tonight," Mallory muttered. "Welcome to the night shift," Pete replied without looking up, his gruff voice tinged with amusement. Mallory forced a smile and busied herself, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in the corner. She couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her, even when her back was turned. When the food was ready, she hesitated before carrying it over. She hadn't noticed before, but the man's hands were resting flat on the table, palms down, as if he were feeling for something beneath the surface. His nails tapped lightly against the laminate, creating a hollow sound. As she placed the plate in front of him, his hand shot out, brushing against hers. It was only a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through her arm, a cold, sharp sensation that was almost metallic, as if she'd touched dry ice. She recoiled instinctively, the tray clattering against the table. The man didn't seem to notice. He began eating slowly, his movements precise and deliberate. Mallory hurried back to the counter, rubbing her arm where he touched her. The sensation lingered, icy and uncomfortable. For the next hour, she tried to avoid looking at him, but she couldn't help stealing glances. He didn't eat like a normal person. Each bite was cut into exact squares, lifted to his mouth with those spindly fingers. Every so often, he'd pause and stare at her, his lips curling into what might have been a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. By 1:30 a.m., the diner was empty except for him. Mallory's nerves were frayed, and she busied herself wiping down the counter. "Do you believe," the man said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "that people leave pieces of themselves behind?" Mallory froze. She turned to face him, her heart thudding against her ribcage. "Excuse me?" When you touch something, or someone, you leave something behind. An imprint, a memory, a trace of yourself. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stood, his towering frame casting long shadows in the dim light. He began walking toward her, his footsteps eerily silent. Mallory instinctively backed up, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You've touched me," he said, holding up his hand. The fingers she had brushed against earlier were now grayish, as though the blood had drained from them entirely. "And now, you're part of me." "Sir, I think you should leave," Mallory managed, her voice trembling. The man's head tilted slightly like he didn't understand. Then in one swift movement, he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. Mallory screamed. The sensation was unbearable, an icy, burning pain that shot through her body like an electric current. Images flashed in her mind, dark, shadowy places, the sound of distant screams, faces contorted in agony. She pulled away, stumbling backward and knocking over a stack of glasses. The man stood there, unmoving, his expression calm and detached. "You feel it, don't you?" he said. "The weight of all those I've touched. They're with me now, part of me. And now so are you." Mallory bolted for the door, but when she turned back, the man was gone. His booth was empty, the plate untouched. But the pain in her shoulder remained, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. She looked down and saw a faint bruise forming in the shape of a handprint. For weeks, Mallory couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She would catch glimpses of movement in mirrors, hear faint whispers when she was alone, and feel phantom touches on her skin. And then one night, she looked down at her hands and saw that her fingers had begun to change, growing longer, thinner, with nails that yellowed and curled at the edges. She realized with dawning horror that she wasn't just carrying his touch, she was becoming him. The smell of gasoline still lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of what once was. The car, an old rust-streaked sedan, sat abandoned at the side of the road. Its headlights were shattered, its hood dented as if something heavy had slammed into it. The surrounding forest loomed dark and silent, the twisted branches of the trees clawing at the night sky. Sarah Parker pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her breath puffing out in visible clouds as the cold night air seeped into her bones. She had worked plenty of night shifts in her 3 years as a deputy, patrolling the same desolate stretch of road in her sleepy little town. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just the creeping fog that blanketed the road, or the eerie glow of the full moon breaking through the branches overhead. It was the car. It hadn't been there during her last pass an hour ago. "Another drunk driver," she muttered to herself, though the unease in her gut told her it wasn't that simple. The way it sat, perfectly still, with its driver's side door yawning open, it felt wrong. Sarah stopped her patrol car, a safe distance behind the sedan, and radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got an abandoned vehicle on Route 9 near mile marker 22. No driver in sight." Static crackled for a moment before her supervisor, Greg, responded. "Copy that, Unit 4. Could be a breakdown. Just check it out and let me know if you need backup." "Will do," she replied, though she hoped she wouldn't have to. Steeling herself, Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the cold. Her boots crunched against the gravel shoulder of the road as she approached the sedan, her flashlight cutting through the fog. There were no skid marks, no signs of an impact other than the dent in the hood. "Anyone here?" she called out, her voice bouncing off the silent forest. No response. She circled the car slowly, her flashlight sweeping over every inch. The windows were streaked with grime, and the inside of the car was a mess. Torn seats, papers scattered across the floor, and what looked like a blanket shoved haphazardly into the back seat. She leaned in closer, her beam illuminating the dashboard. It was smeared with something dark and sticky. Blood? Her throat tightened as she stepped back. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. The forest answered with a low rustle, the sound of branches shifting under the weight of something unseen. Sarah froze, her pulse quickening. She whipped her flashlight toward the trees, but all she saw were shadows dancing in the fog. Then she felt it, a faint pressure against her arm, like the brush of fingers. She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Who's there?" Silence. Her radio crackled suddenly, making her jump. "Sarah, everything okay out there?" Greg's voice broke through the static. "Yeah," she lied, though her voice shook. "Just checking it out." "Be careful," Greg said. "Something feels off tonight." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the car, peering inside once more. That's when she saw it, a single handprint on the passenger seat. It was faint but unmistakable, pressed deep into the fabric as though whoever left it had been clutching the seat in terror. Her stomach churned as she felt that strange pressure again, this time on her shoulder. It was firmer now, insistent, and icy cold. "Enough," she whispered to herself, stepping back from the car. She wasn't paid enough for this. The woods rustled again, louder this time, and her flashlight caught the faintest flicker of movement, something darting between the trees. "Screw this," Sarah muttered, turning on her heel. She didn't care if she looked foolish. She was done with this. But as she reached for the door of her patrol car, she froze. There, smeared across her window, was another handprint. Smaller, more delicate, as if a child had pressed their hand to the glass. It hadn't been there before. Her hands shook as she grabbed her radio. "Greg, I think I..." The line went dead. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away from her car. Suddenly, the engine of the abandoned sedan roared to life. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling as she shone it on the vehicle. The headlights blazed in the darkness, the engine revving louder and louder until it sounded like it might explode. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the car fell silent. The driver's side door slammed shut, and the forest plunged into an oppressive stillness. Sarah's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. Climbing into her patrol car, she locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for her keys, but they slipped from her trembling fingers and fell into the floor. As she bent down to retrieve them, she felt it again, that icy touch brushing against her cheek. She snapped upright, her head striking the roof of the car. Her flashlight rolled off the seat and hit the floor, its beam flickering. In the dim light, she saw them. Fingerprints, dozens of them, appearing one by one on the inside of the windshield, as though unseen hands were pressing against the glass. A scream clawed its way up her throat, but it wouldn't come out. The radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't Greg. "They're coming," a voice whispered. The fingerprints vanished all at once, leaving the glass fogged with the outline of a face pressed against it. Sarah slammed the car into reverse, her tires screeching as she sped down the road. The rest of the story will add layers of escalation, such as Sarah discovering a disturbing history about the car, a family disappearing in it, strange encounters at her station, and the increasing presence of those ghostly touches. It would culminate in a terrifying confrontation where Sarah learns she is now marked by these unseen forces, tied to the car forever. It was well past midnight when Mark clocked in for his night shift at the small, rundown pizza joint on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting a sickly hue over the greasy counters and cluttered kitchen. The place had been struggling for years, its charm long faded, and tonight felt like any other night, quiet, with only a handful of orders coming through. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional beep of the oven were the only sounds breaking the silence. As he donned his uniform and settled behind the counter, Mark thought about how little the job mattered to him anymore. He had been working here for over 2 years, his enthusiasm long gone. At first, he had enjoyed the camaraderie of the kitchen and the fast pace, but now, everything felt hollow. The staff had dwindled down to just a few regulars who came in to kill time, and the hours dragged on, each shift blending into the next. Tonight, the chill in the air and the dark clouds hanging ominously outside the window gnawed at him. Something about it felt different. Maybe it was the sense of isolation, or maybe it was the unease that stirred within him as the night settled in. He barely had time to let his mind wander before the first order of the evening came in. A large pizza, pepperoni, and extra cheese for a man named Mr. Holloway. Mark frowned as he scribbled the name down on the ticket. He had never heard of a Mr. Holloway in this part of town. The address was unfamiliar too, deep in the woods, about 15 miles away from the restaurant. The name Holloway struck Mark as strange. It sounded almost familiar, but he couldn't place where from. Maybe he'd heard it in passing, or maybe it was just the late hour playing tricks on his mind. Whatever it was, the job had been slow tonight, and the thought of delivering the pizza didn't sit well with him. But it was better than doing nothing. He could use the extra tip. Mark shrugged off his unease and pulled on his jacket. He grabbed the pizza and set off, locking the door behind him. The night air felt colder than usual as he walked to his car. The engine roared to life, and he turned onto the empty street, heading toward the unfamiliar address. The drive was eerily quiet, the roads narrow and winding as they twisted through dense trees. The wind howled through the branches, their skeletal limbs reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. The headlights of his car barely illuminated the path ahead, and soon he found himself driving deeper into the woods. With every turn, the city lights faded behind him, replaced by darkness, the kind that seemed to swallow everything whole. Mark glanced at the address again. The place seemed more remote than he had imagined. There were no houses nearby, just trees stretching endlessly in all directions. The feeling of isolation settled in, a heavy weight pressing against his chest. He tried to shake it off, but it clung to him, gnawing at his nerves. As he slowed to a stop in front of an old, dilapidated house, a strange feeling washed over him. The house loomed in the distance, its dark windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. It looked abandoned, nothing but peeling paint and sagging roof shingles. But something about it was off, like it was waiting for him. Mark parked the car and hesitated for a moment. The air here was different, thicker, almost suffocating. The chills seemed to seep into his bones, and he shivered involuntarily. He tried to calm himself and walked toward the front door. The sound of his footsteps muffled against the dirt path. He rang the doorbell. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. His hand gripped the cold brass doorknob, and it turned with an eerie creak. The door opened slowly, as if it had been expecting him. Mark stepped inside, feeling an odd magnetic pull toward the house. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering light overhead. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The furniture was old, covered in dusty sheets. It felt like no one had lived here in years, yet everything seemed untouched, frozen in time. There was a faint noise from the corner of the room, like the rustling of fabric. Mark froze, his heart skipped a beat. He called out, "Mr. Holloway?" His voice echoed off the walls, but there was no response. A strange feeling settled in his gut, like something was watching him, just out of sight. He set the pizza down on a nearby table and turned to leave. But as he did, a sudden cold touch grazed his shoulder. His body tensed, and his breath caught in his throat. He spun around, but there was no one there. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, making him jump. A voice, weak, tremulous, whispered from the shadows, "Help me!" Mark's pulse raced, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. "Who's there?" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. A man, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. His clothes were tattered, as though he had been living in squalor for years. His movements were jerky and unnerving, like a puppet with its strings cut. The man's thin, bony hand reached out toward Mark, his fingers trembling. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Don't leave me here." Mark stepped back instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. Something wasn't right. The air had grown colder, and the man's presence felt wrong, as though he didn't belong in this world. The touch, Mark thought. The touch would be enough to end it all. Before Mark could make a move, the man's hand brushed against his wrist. It was like ice, freezing, biting into his skin. Mark recoiled in horror, but the man's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Mark's flesh with surprising strength. "You shouldn't have come," the man hissed, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "It's too late now." Mark's pulse quickened. He tried to pull away, but the man's grip only tightened, sending waves of panic surging through his body. The room around him seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The lights flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. Mark's breath grew shallow as the figure pulled him closer. A strange pressure pressed against his chest, as if something invisible was squeezing the life out of him. The whispers grew louder, voices that weren't his own, their words slithering into his mind. Suddenly, the grip released. Mark stumbled backward, gasping for air, but the sensation lingered, cold, clammy, suffocating. The whispers seemed to swirl around him, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. He turned to leave, but as he reached for the door, a sharp pain shot through his chest. His breath hitched as the cold sensation spread, like 1,000 icy needles piercing his skin. His fingers clawed at his chest as though trying to tear it out. Something was inside him. Something was alive within him, moving, burrowing deeper with every passing second. He staggered toward the door, but before he could reach it, the man lunged at him. His cold fingers sank into Mark's flesh, gripping his arms with unnatural force. The world around him began to warp. The floor seemed to shift beneath him, and the shadows stretched unnaturally. Mark screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The cold touch seized his body, his very soul. The world was dissolving around him, leaving nothing but the unbearable pressure of the grip. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat slow and agonizing. Then with one final desperate effort, Mark tore himself free. He flung open the door and fled into the night, the cold air slamming into him like a shock of ice. But it didn't stop the burning sensation that now consumed his entire body. The touch had marked him, left its cold, vile imprint on his skin. By the time Mark reached his car, the pain was unbearable. He collapsed into the driver's seat, gasping for breath. His arm, now raw and marked with pale, ghostly fingerprints, burned with a cold that wouldn't fade. The sensation of those fingers, the touch that had latched onto him, refused to leave. It stayed with him, gnawing at his skin, his mind. He glanced at the road ahead, but the woods seemed to close in, their shadows twisting, reaching toward him. The pizza delivery had been a trap, but the real horror was far worse. The touch, the cold, clammy, suffocating touch, was a curse, one that would haunt Mark for the rest of his life. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel it. Always there, always waiting, just beyond his reach. And now, no matter how far he ran, it would never let him go. Maria had worked at the old rundown motel on the edge of town for almost a year. The place was known for its cheap rooms, but it wasn't popular enough to attract many customers. Most of the guests came late at night, shuffling in after a long day of driving, only to leave early the next morning. It was the perfect job for someone who didn't mind the quiet of the graveyard shift. Or at least it had been. The air in the lobby was thick with a mixture of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the faint scent of mildew from the old carpets. The flickering neon sign outside cast an eerie glow that barely penetrated the dim room. Maria sat behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine with dog-eared pages. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unusually loud, its rhythmic beat a constant reminder that the night was crawling forward at a snail's pace. It was just another typical evening, or so she thought. Maria had grown used to the silence, the feeling of isolation that came with working the night shift. There had been a few strange moments in the past, odd guests with bizarre requests, cryptic phone calls, or the occasional unexplained noise in the walls, but nothing that had ever truly unsettled her. That was until tonight. As the clock struck 11 p.m., Maria's sense of unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, like a shadow just out of the corner of her eye, but the tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, something was watching her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of the phone. It was an old rotary model, the kind that had become a relic in this age of cell phones. Maria hesitated. She hadn't heard the phone ring in weeks, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the empty lobby. With a sigh, she picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling slightly. "Hello?" she said, trying to sound calm. There was no response, just the sound of slow, labored breathing on the other end. She held her breath, waiting. Then a raspy whisper crackled through the line. "You feel that?" Maria's pulse quickened. Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" she demanded, though her voice quivered. The whisper grew more intense. "It's me. Touch me." Maria's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately slammed the receiver down. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who could have been on the other end? Why did it feel so wrong? She sat frozen for a few moments, trying to convince herself it was just a prank. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to spook her with a mysterious phone call. But this felt different. The voice had been too clear, too urgent, and for some reason, it made her skin crawl. Trying to shake off the feeling, Maria returned to her magazine, though her eyes barely registered the words on the pages. The clock continued to tick, and the silence in the motel lobby felt heavier than ever. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in. A car's headlights suddenly flashed through the lobby windows, pulling Maria's attention away from the eerie stillness. She glanced up and saw a dusty old sedan pull into the parking lot. It was late, far later than anyone usually checked in, and the car's lone engine sputtered as it came to a halt. Maria's heart skipped in anticipation. The headlights were the only light in the otherwise dark parking lot. A man stepped out of the car. He was tall, with a haggard appearance. His clothes were disheveled, and his face was gaunt, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He looked around the empty lot with hollow eyes before making his way inside. Maria forced a smile as he approached the counter. "Checking in?" she asked, trying to keep her tone professional, though her voice trembled slightly. The man nodded but didn't speak. He only stared at her, his eyes unnervingly intense. It felt like his gaze was drilling into her, searching her soul. Maria felt an overwhelming compulsion to look away, but something in his stare kept her frozen. She couldn't tear her eyes from him. "Room 6, he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, I've been waiting for you." Maria blinked, confused by his strange words. She grabbed the key for room 6, her fingers brushing his as she handed it to him. His touch was cold, unnaturally cold. A sudden jolt shot through her body, like a spark of electricity that left her skin crawling. She quickly withdrew her hand, but the chill from his touch lingered, crawling up her arm. The man didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked down the hallway toward room 6, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Maria stood there for a moment, her heart still racing. Something wasn't right. The air felt colder, thicker, as though something unseen was pressing in from all sides. Hours passed, and the silence deepened. Maria couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. She tried to distract herself by flipping through the magazine again, but her mind kept returning to the strange man in room 6. His touch, his eyes, they wouldn't leave her thoughts. Around midnight, the phone rang again. Maria jumped, startled by the sudden noise. Her hands were clammy as she reached for the receiver, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "You felt it, didn't you?" the voice whispered, sending a chill down her spine. "You felt the touch." Maria froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands shook as she slammed the receiver down. She looked toward the hallway, her senses on high alert. The silence felt oppressive now, as if the whole motel was holding its breath. The door to room 6 creaked open, and Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward her. The man emerged from the shadows, his face even paler now, his eyes wide and frantic. He approached the counter without a word, his eyes locked onto hers. He didn't speak, but his hands shot out, fingers curling like claws as he reached for her. Maria's body froze, her legs unwilling to move. His fingers brushed her wrist, and the touch sent a shockwave through her, colder than before, like something frozen deep in the earth. "Why won't you touch me back?" he whispered, his voice trembling with desperation. "It's not enough. I need you to touch me." Maria's mind screamed at her to run, to get away, but her body was paralyzed. His grip tightened, and the room seemed to warp around her. The shadows in the corners stretched toward her, and the air grew thick, suffocating. The man's touch was no longer just cold. It was as if it had penetrated deep into her bones, draining her strength with each passing second. She tried to pull away, but it was impossible. Her vision blurred, her body weakened, and the oppressive silence enveloped her like a shroud. Then, without warning, everything went silent. The man's grip loosened, and he stepped back, his face contorting into a satisfied grin. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. When morning came, Maria's body was found in the lobby, cold and lifeless. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her fingers still outstretched, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her skin was marked with a faint, icy handprint, the skin around it blackened and withered. The phone continued to ring, but no one was left to answer.